She came home from closing a $70 million deal to find a one-page letter waiting on her own kitchen island. Her husband, one of Chicago's most feared crime bosses, wanted her gone by tomorrow night, so his mistress could move into the house. He thought the mansion was his. He thought the money was his. He thought she was his. He was wrong about every single thing. If you want to see exactly how far a quiet woman's revenge can go, stay until the end, hit like, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Rain came down in sheets over Lake Michigan, the kind of October rain that turned headlights into smeared gold ribbons on the outer drive, and Vivian Ashcroft sat in the back of a black Suburban with her laptop bag clutched against her chest like a shield. Her phone read 11:47 p.m. Her flight from Seattle had been delayed 2 hours on the tarmac, and she hadn't eaten anything but a stale protein bar since noon, and her body ached in that specific, hollowed-out way that came only after 14 hours of negotiating with men who underestimated her in the first 10 minutes and regretted it by the last. She'd just signed the biggest contract of her career. Ashcroft Cyber Defense was now the exclusive threat intelligence partner for a consortium of 3 regional banks, a deal worth $22 million over 4 years, and somewhere in the pit of her stomach, she'd expected to feel something. Triumph, relief, anything. Instead, she felt the dull static of exhaustion and an itch at the back of her neck she couldn't name. The driver pulled through the iron gates of the Lakeshore estate a few minutes after midnight. The house rose out of the dark like something carved from ash. Gray stone, black windows, ivy gone skeletal with the season. 12 years she'd lived behind those gates. 12 years of learning which rooms held warmth and which ones only held cold marble and colder silence. Tonight, every window was dark. That was wrong. Damien kept the porch lanterns burning even when he traveled, some old superstition about the dead returning home to find no light. She paid the driver, told him to keep the change, and stood under the portico with rain hammering the slate above her head while she fumbled her key into the lock with fingers gone numb. The foyer smelled like nothing. No cologne, no wood smoke from the fireplace Damien insisted on lighting every evening regardless of season, a habit from his childhood that she'd once found endearing and now mostly found absurd. She flicked the switch. Light flooded the marble floor, the curved staircase, the oil portrait of Damien's grandfather glowering down from the landing like he disapproved of her on principle. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Nothing answered but the tick of the grandfather clock in the study. She walked toward the kitchen, heels echoing, and that's when she saw it. An ivory envelope, propped against the fruit bowl on the marble island, her name written across the front in Damien's sharp, slanted hand. Vivian. Not love or darling or any of the words he used to scrawl on Post-its and leave on her laptop in the early years. Back when his hands used to shake a little just touching her, back before the Empire swallowed whatever softness he'd started with. Just her name. Like a subpoena, she set down her bag. She didn't sit. Some instinct told her she needed to be standing for whatever this was. She slit the envelope with her thumbnail and unfolded a single sheet of cream stationery. And she read it once fast and then again slow because the first read felt like a mistake her brain had made, some kind of glitch. And the second read confirmed that no, this was real. These were his actual words, written in his actual hand. Vivian, 12 years was enough. I'm done. Natalie is moving in tomorrow night, and I want you out of the house before she arrives. I'll have someone send your things wherever you land. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You always knew this life wasn't built for someone like you. D. She read the word Natalie a third time, like maybe it would rearrange itself into a name she recognized as a stranger's, a business associate, anyone but who she knew it was. Natalie Brooks. 31 years old, a socialite with a private jet habit and a laugh that carried across restaurants, married to Jonathan Brooks, a corporate attorney who handled half of Chicago's real estate litigation. Vivian had stood beside that woman at 3 different charity galas, had complimented her dress once, a deep emerald thing that probably cost more than most people's cars. Natalie had smiled back with teeth so white they looked manufactured and said something forgettable about the silent auction. Vivian's hand wasn't shaking. She noticed that distinctly, almost clinically, the way she noticed everything when her mind shifted into the gear she used for crisis. The gear that had built a company from a laptop and a folding table in a rented Bridgeport apartment into a $70 million firm while her husband told dinner guests she had a cute little hobby with computers. She set the letter down on the island, flat, like evidence. She thought about Damien's face. Not the face he wore now, jaw set, eyes flat. A man who'd learned to negotiate hostage situations and corporate buyouts with the same chilling calm. She thought instead about the face he'd had at 26, the year they met, when he was still climbing inside the Moreau organization and not yet running it, when he used to laugh with his whole chest and look at her like she was the only unguarded thing he'd allowed himself in years. That man was dead. She understood that now in a way she hadn't quite let herself understand before, standing in her own kitchen at midnight reading her own eviction notice. She walked to the wine fridge built into the island, the one Damien had installed for entertaining clients. He never actually entertained at home, because home, he always said, was for family. A word he'd apparently redefined sometime in the last few months without telling her. She didn't pour wine. She wasn't going to drink through this. She needed her head sharp, sharper than it had ever been. Instead, she walked to the study, sat down at the antique desk that had been her grandmother's, the one piece of furniture in this entire mansion that was unambiguously hers, and she opened her laptop. Her reflection caught in the dark screen before it woke. 38 years old, dark hair pulled back from 12 hours of travel, eyes that looked tired but not broken. Not broken. She filed that observation away like data. She typed 2 words into her search bar. Divorce attorney. Then she deleted it and typed something more specific. Best divorce attorney, Illinois Ruthless. The third result down was a name she recognized from a Crane Chicago business profile 2 years back. Eleanor Pierce, founding partner of Pierce and Whitfield, a woman the article had described, in language clearly meant as a compliment from one shark to another, as someone who'd never lost a case she truly wanted to win, and who reportedly kept a framed photo in her office of an opposing counsel's resignation letter. Vivian found a personal cell number through a mutual contact at the bank consortium she'd just closed with. She turned out everyone in this city's upper echelon was 3 calls removed from everyone else, a fact she'd learned to exploit rather than resent. And she typed out a text at 12:14 a.m. This is Vivian Ashcroft. I need to retain you immediately. It's urgent, and it cannot wait until morning. I can pay whatever retainer you require tonight. She didn't expect a response before sunrise. She was wrong. Her phone buzzed 4 minutes later. Eleanor Pierce. Tell me everything. I'm awake. Vivian almost laughed. The first real impulse toward laughter she'd felt in hours. And then she started typing, fast, methodical, the same way she used to write incident reports during her early years doing security consulting, back before she'd built her own firm. Facts only. No adjectives. No bleeding onto the page. She wrote about the letter, about Natalie Brooks, about the deadline, tomorrow night. Eleanor's reply came back almost instantly. Does the mansion have a deed in both your names, or his alone? Vivian sat back in the chair her grandmother used to read in, and for the first time that night, something close to a smile moved across her face. Not happiness. Something colder and more useful than happiness. The mansion is mine. Solely mine. It's held through the Ashcroft family trust. My grandmother set it up before I married him. Damien doesn't know. There was a pause on the other end. Vivian could practically hear the gears turning 300 miles away in whatever penthouse or office Eleanor Pierce occupied at this hour. Good. That changes everything about how fast we move. Don't respond to him tonight. Don't engage at all. I'll have eviction paperwork and a restraining order petition drafted by 8 a.m. We're filing emergency motions before his lawyers have finished their coffee. Get some sleep if you can. Vivian typed back a single word, understood, and set the phone down on the desk. Sleep wasn't coming. She knew that the moment Eleanor's message landed because something had shifted in her chest, some gear she hadn't used in years finally catching and turning. She'd spent 12 years making herself smaller in this house, quieter, less visible. She'd learned the hard way in the first 3 years of marriage that Damien's world had no room in it for a wife who took up too much space, who asked too many questions about the men who came to the house late at night, about the duffel bags that disappeared into the garage and reappeared empty. About the encrypted calls he took standing on the back terrace in February without a coat because some habits of caution outranked even comfort. She'd learned to build her company instead in the spaces he didn't watch, in the hours between 4 and 7 in the morning before he woke. In hotel rooms during the trips he assumed were wellness retreats, because that's what she let him assume. She'd built Ashcroft cyber defense in the cracks of a marriage that had slowly, methodically, stopped seeing her as anything but furniture. Expensive, well-kept furniture that occasionally hosted dinner parties and never embarrassed him in front of his associates. She walked to the window of the study and looked out at the black water of the lake, rain still coming down hard enough to blur the city lights across the water into a smear of amber. You always knew this life wasn't built for someone like you. That line. That was the one that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, because for years she had believed that. She'd believed she was the soft thing in a hard house, the civilian married into a world of men who solved problems with leverage, and sometimes worse than leverage. A woman who kept her head down in her questions to herself because that was the price of the mansion, the lake view, the life Damien had built around her like a cage dressed up as a castle. But somewhere in the last 3 years, she could trace it now, looking back, to the night she'd found out from a business partner, almost by accident, that Damien had been skimming from his own captains, redirecting funds through shell investment vehicles she happened to recognize, because cybersecurity work meant she understood exactly how dirty money liked to dress itself up clean. Somewhere in there, the soft thing had started growing teeth. She just hadn't told anyone, not even herself, not in so many words. She went upstairs at 1 a.m., not to the master bedroom, but to the guest suite at the end of the East Hall, the one with its own bathroom and its own locking door, the one she'd started sleeping in 8 months ago after a fight about nothing that was really a fight about everything, and she lay on top of the covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and did not cry. She kept waiting to cry. The crying didn't come. What came instead was a list, forming itself in her mind with the precision of a project plan. Call Cole Mercer first thing, move the trust documents to a secure location, change the codes on the home security system Damien thought he controlled, but which she had quietly administered for 2 years now because she was the one who actually understood the technology. Pull the financial statements for Ashcroft Cyber Defense to make absolutely certain nothing tied back to him. Call her CFO. Call her banker. Call. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. 1:52 a.m. Damien. She stared at the screen for 11 full seconds before answering, mostly because Eleanor had told her not to engage and some animal part of her wanted, badly, to obey that instruction, to let the silence be its own weapon. But 12 years of marriage had taught her things too, and one of them was that with Damien, silence sometimes read as weakness. And weakness invited him closer, the way a predator closes distance on something that goes still. She picked up. "Vivian." His voice was rough, like he'd been drinking, though Damien rarely let alcohol show. "You got my letter." "I got it. I figured you'd call screaming or crying, something." A pause, the click of ice against glass somewhere on his end. "You're quiet." "What do you want me to say, Damien?" "I want you to understand this isn't personal. You and we built something good for a long time, but it's over, and I'd rather do this clean. I'll make sure you're taken care of." She closed her eyes. 12 years of his voice, and she could still hear underneath the casual cruelty, the specific cadence he used when he was performing reasonableness for an audience he believed was listening. Except there was no audience here, just her, just the rain against the window, just the two of them, and a marriage he'd apparently already filed away as a closed account. "Taken care of," she repeated. "Vivian, you wrote that I should be out of the house before Natalie moves in tomorrow night." Her voice came out level, almost conversational. "Did you write that letter believing the house belongs to you?" A beat of silence. Something in his tone shifted, the faintest crack of irritation. "It's been our home for 12 years. "That's not what I asked." "Don't do the lawyer thing with me right now. I'm not in the mood." "I'm not doing the lawyer thing, Damien. I'm asking you a direct question, because I think you should know the answer before tomorrow night arrives." She sat up slowly, swinging her legs over the side of the bed, planting her bare feet on the cold hardwood like she needed the ground to be real beneath her. "The mansion was never in your name. It's never been in your name. It was placed in the Ashcroft family trust by my grandmother before we married, and it has remained there for the entire duration of our marriage. Every dollar of renovation, every improvement, every brick. It sits on land and inside walls that belong solely, legally, irrevocably to me. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that she could hear, faintly, the murmur of a television or maybe a party in the background, glasses clinking, a woman's laugh that wasn't hers. "You're lying," Damien said finally, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Check the county records yourself. I'm sure your lawyers can find the filing in about 4 minutes." She stood now, walked to the window again, watched the rain. "You ordered me out of my own house, Damien. I think that's something you should sit with." "Vivian, listen to me. No." The word came out of her with a force that surprised even her, a force that had been compressing inside her chest for years and finally found a crack to escape through. "I have listened to you for 12 years. I listened when you told me my business was a hobby. I listened when you told me not to ask questions about your work. I listened when you told me which dresses were appropriate and which dinners I was allowed to attend and which friends of mine made you uncomfortable. I am done listening tonight. You don't get to talk to me like that." "I just did." She hung up before he could answer. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. It slammed against her ribs hard enough that she had to sit back down on the edge of the bed and breathe through it. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. A technique she'd learned years ago during her first stress-laden months building the company, back when panic used to ambush her in boardrooms and she'd had to teach her own nervous system how to behave. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. She let it ring out. It buzzed a second time, a third. She turned it face down on the nightstand and sat in the dark, listening to her own pulse slow by degrees. And somewhere underneath the fear, because yes, there was fear, she wasn't a fool. She knew exactly what kind of man she'd just spoken to that way, knew exactly what organization stood behind him. Underneath the fear was something that felt almost like exhilaration, like surfacing after years underwater. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't try. By 4 a.m., she was back at the desk in the study, laptop open, methodically pulling together every document she could think of. The trust paperwork, scanned and backed up to 3 separate secure locations. The original incorporation documents for Ashcroft Cyber Defense, showing sole ownership, bank statements demonstrating that not $1 of company revenue had ever touched a joint account, the prenuptial agreement Damien had insisted on 12 years ago, back when he had more money than she did and wanted to protect the family interests, a document that, she now realized with grim amusement, was about to protect her interests instead, since it explicitly excluded any business she built independently from marital assets. He'd built the trap. He just hadn't realized he'd built it for himself. At 6:30 a.m., she called Cole Mercer. She'd met Cole 18 months ago through a cybersecurity conference. A former federal agent, FBI, organized crime division, 14 years, who'd left the bureau under circumstances he never fully explained and now ran a private intelligence and investigations firm out of a nondescript office in the West Loop. They'd worked together twice on corporate espionage cases for Ashcroft clients. He was the only person in her professional life who'd ever looked at her and seen, immediately, without being told, that she was sharper than the room gave her credit for. He picked up on the second ring, voice rough with sleep. "Ashcroft, it's 6:30. I need you, Cole. Today. It's not business, or it is, but it's also personal. Damien wants me out of the house. He's moving someone else in." A pause, and then the particular silence of a man waking up fast, sitting up in bed, reaching for whatever notepad lived on his nightstand. "Give me the short version." She gave it to him, fast, clean, the same way she'd given it to Eleanor hours before. Cole listened without interrupting, which she appreciated more than she could say, because everyone else in her life who'd ever heard hard news from her had felt the need to fill silences with sympathy she didn't have room for yet. "Okay," Cole said when she finished. "Couple things. First, I'm sorry. Genuinely. Second, and I need you to hear this as information, not as me trying to scare you. Damien Moreau isn't just some guy who cheated on his wife. You know what he is. You've known for years, even if you've never said it out loud to me. Men like that don't lose gracefully. The eviction filing is going to humiliate him in front of people who matter to his standing. That's dangerous." "I know. I don't think you do. Not fully. But you will by the end of today. She heard him moving, the creak of a chair, the click of a laptop opening. I want to start digging, quietly. I want to understand exactly what's been happening with his finances, because something's been bothering me for months, and I never said anything because it wasn't my business. Now it is. What's been bothering you? The man's spending has outpaced anything that makes sense for legitimate income, even accounting for whatever the family business brings in off the books. I've seen patterns like this before back at the bureau. It usually means someone's either skimming from people they shouldn't skim from or building an exit fund, or both. Vivian closed her eyes. Some part of her had known this too. In the vague, unexamined way, a person knows about termites in the walls long before they see the damage. Find out, she said. I need to know exactly what I'm protecting myself from. I'll start this morning. Vivian, he paused. Get the locks changed today. Not tomorrow. Today. And don't be alone in that house tonight. She thanked him and hung up, and sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the cold surface of her grandmother's desk, feeling the old wood under her palms, feeling something steady itself inside her chest. By 8:15 a.m., Eleanor Pierce called. I have the eviction petition drafted, along with an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order based on the threatening nature of his communication last night and his organizational affiliations, which I think a judge will find persuasive even without getting too specific. I also have divorce papers ready to file the moment you give the word. I need you to come into the office today and sign everything in person. We move fast, Vivian, or we don't move at all. I'll be there by 10. One more thing. Eleanor's voice took on a different texture, something almost gentle underneath the steel. Are you safe right now? I think so, for now. I'm putting a security recommendation in front of you regardless. I have a contact, a protective services firm, very discreet, very good. Given who your husband is, I'd be doing you a disservice not to insist. Vivian thought of Cole's voice an hour earlier. Don't be alone in that house tonight, and felt the fear she'd been holding at arm's length finally settle fully into her body, cold and real. Send me the contact, she said. I'll call them this morning. She showered, dressed in the gray suit she usually saved for closing meetings. The armor she put on when she needed the world to see competence rather than the chaos underneath. And she stood for a long moment in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her own face. No makeup yet, eyes shadowed from the sleepless night, but something steady in the set of her jaw that hadn't been there in years. You always knew this life wasn't built for someone like you. You have no idea what I'm built for, she said to the mirror, quietly. And for the first time since reading that letter, her voice didn't shake at all. She drove herself downtown that morning. She'd sent the driver home the night before and didn't trust anyone from Damien's world to ferry her anywhere today. Gripping the wheel through rain that hadn't let up since midnight, the wipers beating a frantic rhythm against the windshield while the city rose gray and indifferent ahead of her. Eleanor Pierce's office occupied the 31st floor of a glass tower on LaSalle Street, all clean lines and cold light, and Eleanor herself turned out to be exactly what Vivian had hoped for. Early 50s, silver-streaked hair cut into a severe bob, a voice that could probably negotiate hostage releases if it ever came to that, and eyes that assessed Vivian in about 4 seconds and seemed to like what they found. Sit, Eleanor said, sliding a stack of documents across the conference table. We're filing within the hour. I want you to understand something before you sign anything, Vivian. Once we file, there's no quiet version of this. Damien Moreau is going to receive an eviction notice naming him a tenant in a house he believed he owned, in front of whatever lawyers he brings with him to respond. That is going to be a humiliation he experiences publicly, among people whose respect he depends on. I need you prepared for how he reacts to that. Vivian thought of the duffel bags disappearing into the garage, the encrypted calls on the terrace, the captains who came to dinner with their jackets cut wide enough to hide what she now understood, with sudden cold clarity, were probably weapons. I'm prepared, she said, and picked up the pen. She signed the divorce petition. She signed the eviction filing. She signed the restraining order request, citing the threatening tenor of his late-night call and his known criminal affiliations as grounds for emergency consideration. Her hand was steady through every signature, page after page, 12 years of marriage dissolving into a stack of paper with her own careful signature at the bottom of each. When she finished, Eleanor gathered the documents and looked at her with something that might have been respect. There's no walking this back once we file. You understand that? I understand. Good. Eleanor almost smiled. Because I have a feeling, Mrs. Ashcroft, that you're about to become the most interesting case of my career. By noon, the paperwork was filed with the Cook County courts. By 12:30, a process server, a quiet, competent young man Eleanor's firm used regularly, someone who looked utterly unbothered by the prospect of serving documents on a man whose name made federal prosecutors sit up straighter in their chairs, left Eleanor's office with a folder containing the eviction notice, instructions to deliver it personally, and a deadline, end of business today. Vivian sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from Eleanor's office, untouched espresso going cold in front of her, and watched her phone like it might detonate. It detonated at 2:47 p.m., a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Marcus Webb, counsel for Mr. Moreau. We need to speak immediately regarding documents that have just been served at his place of business. She didn't respond. Eleanor had been explicit about that. All communication routes through counsel now, no exceptions, no matter how many times he called. He called 11 times between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. She watched each one ring out, her stomach tightening a little more with each missed call, imagining the scene that must be unfolding somewhere across the city. Damien, surrounded by his lawyers and his captains, and whatever inner circle convened in his glass-walled office on the 34th floor of the building, his organization quietly owned through 4 layers of shell companies, opening an envelope to discover that the mansion he'd just ordered his wife out of belonged, in full, irrevocably, to her. She tried to picture his face in that moment and found, to her own surprise, that she didn't want to. Not out of mercy, out of something closer to self-preservation. She didn't need to watch him break to know that she had, finally, after 12 years, found the one weapon in this entire marriage that he could neither outcharm nor outmuscle. The truth. Cole called at 7:15 p.m., his voice tight in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Vivian, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to panic. Her stomach dropped. What did you find? I've been pulling threads on Damien's finances since this morning, cross-referencing some patterns against things I remember from my bureau days. I started seeing money moving through 3 different investment vehicles that on paper look like clean, legitimate funds. Real estate holdings, a private equity shell, an offshore account structure that's almost elegant in how it's built, almost like someone designed it to survive a basic audit. And it doesn't survive a thorough one. Vivian, the volume of money moving through these accounts over the last 18 months is in the tens of millions. Far more than legitimate business income could explain, even generously. Some of it traces back to construction contracts that don't appear to correspond to any actual construction. Some of it routes through luxury real estate purchases under names I don't recognize yet, but the transaction patterns, the timing, the structuring just under reporting thresholds, that's not how a businessman moves money. That's how someone launders it. Vivian sat very still in her car outside the mansion, engine running, rain drumming on the roof, the house dark and unfamiliar ahead of her like a place she'd never actually lived. Cole, tell me what you think this means. A long pause. When Cole spoke again, his voice had dropped into the flat, careful register she imagined he'd used delivering hard news in his federal days. I think your husband isn't just connected to organized crime anymore, Vivian. I think he's been actively running a laundering operation through his own organization's money, probably skimming from his own captains to fund something. A lifestyle. An exit. I don't know yet. I think the man you've been married to for 12 years has become exactly the kind of target federal task forces spend entire careers trying to build a case against. Vivian looked up at her own dark house through the rain-streaked windshield, and somewhere behind her ribs, something that had been holding very still for 12 years finally, quietly, broke open. Cole, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need you to keep digging. I need to know everything tonight. Vivian, I have to tell you, if this is what it looks like, you're not just looking at a messy divorce anymore. You're standing next to a man the federal government is going to come for, eventually, with or without your help. The question becomes whether you're standing close enough to get caught in the blast radius when it happens. Through the windshield, lightning lit the lake silver for half a second. And in that flash of light, Vivian Ashcroft watched her own front door, the door to the house that was legally, undeniably hers, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the last 20 hours, that she had no intention of running from what was coming. She intended to be standing directly in the center of it when it arrived. "Find everything," she said into the phone, and hung up just as her phone buzzed once more. A final voicemail notification from Damien, the 12th call of the day, and beneath it, a new message from a number she didn't recognize at all. 3 words that made her blood run cold even before she opened it. "We need to talk." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The unsigned text sat on her screen like a loaded gun on a table. "We need to talk." Vivian stared at it until the letters blurred, until the rain on the windshield became the only sound in the world, and then she did the thing Cole had told her never to do. She called the number back. It rang twice. A man's voice answered, low, unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who'd learned a long time ago that calm was more frightening than shouting. "Mrs. Moreau." "Ashcroft," she said. "Who is this?" "Marcus Webb. I'm Damien's attorney. We met once, I think. The Christmas party 2 years back. The one at the Drake." She remembered him now. Tall, silver at the temples, a handshake that lasted half a second too long. "What do you want, Mr. Webb?" "I want to suggest, strongly, that you call off whatever this is before it goes further than either of you can walk back. Damien is, let's say, agitated. The filing this afternoon caught him in front of people he can't afford to look weak in front of. I'm sure you understand the optics." "I don't care about his optics." "You should." A pause, the particular silence of a man choosing his next words with care. "I'm not threatening you, Mrs. Ashcroft. I want to be very clear about that because I know how this sounds. I'm telling you, as someone who has represented this family for 9 years, that there is a version of tonight where this gets resolved quietly and a version where it doesn't. I'd like to help you find the first version." "Then tell your client," Vivian said, her voice flat and even despite the hammering in her chest, "that the eviction notice was accurate, that the mansion belongs to me, that it has always belonged to me, and that nothing he says tonight is going to change a single fact in those documents. If he wants to negotiate, he can do it through Eleanor Pierce. I'm done talking to him directly." "Vivian," she hung up. Her hands were shaking now, finally, the adrenaline of the entire day catching up with her body all at once, and she sat in the driveway with the engine running and the rain coming down and made herself breathe until the shaking stopped. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. She thought about Cole's voice. Don't be alone in that house tonight. And for the first time, she let herself actually be afraid, instead of just acknowledging the fear from a safe analytical distance. She drove to a hotel instead of going inside. The Peninsula, 20 minutes north, a place Damien had never once taken her, and therefore a place she trusted no one from his world would think to look first. She checked in under her maiden name, which still felt strange in her mouth after 12 years of being a Moreau, in every legal sense but the deed records. And she sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room and finally let herself cry. Not from sadness, she realized. Somewhere in the middle of it, but from the sheer physical exhaustion of holding herself together for 19 straight hours. She didn't sleep much. She didn't expect to. Across the city, in a glass-walled corner office on the 34th floor of a building that bore his organization's fingerprints through 4 layers of holding companies, Damien Moreau stood at the window with a folder in his hand that he had now read 7 times, as if rereading it might change what was written inside. The eviction notice. His name listed as a tenant. Tenant. In a house he had walked into as a king for 12 years, host to senators and union bosses, and men whose names appeared in newspapers only when something had gone catastrophically wrong. A house where he had once stood on the back terrace and told his father, dead 11 years now, that he had finally built something the old man would have respected. Behind him, his consigliere Tony Ricci shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes creaking against the marble. Tony had been with Damien 15 years, since before Damien took over from his uncle. And in 15 years, Tony had rarely seen the boss's hands shake the way they were shaking now around the edge of that folder. "Boss," Tony said carefully, "we should talk this through before you do something you can't take back. She humiliated me." Damien didn't turn around. His reflection hung ghost-like in the dark window, superimposed over the city lights below. "In front of my own people. You think Falcone didn't see this? You think word isn't already moving through every captain in this organization that Vivian Ashcroft just kicked the boss out of his own house like he's nobody? With respect, it's not her house. Technically, it never was your house, the deed says. I know what the deed says, Tony. Damien turned, and Tony took an involuntary half-step back from whatever was in his eyes. I've read it 7 times. You think I need you to read it to me an 8th? Tony held his hands up, palms out, the universal gesture of a man backing off a live wire. I'm just saying, we move careful here. This isn't a business problem we can solve with the usual tools. She's got lawyers, good ones. Eleanor Pierce doesn't lose. Everybody loses eventually. Not like this. Not against someone who's got the paper trail on her side and nothing, boss, connecting her to anything that would make a judge think twice about siding with her. Tony lowered his voice, glanced at the closed door like the walls themselves might be listening, which in this building they sometimes were. And there's something else. Cole Mercer. Damien's jaw tightened. What about him? He's been asking questions. Quiet ones, but questions. One of my contacts at the title company flagged some activity. Somebody pulling records on the lakeshore properties, the investment vehicles, going back 18 months. Smart Money says it's him, working for her. For a long moment, Damien said nothing. Rain streaked the window behind him, the lake invisible now beyond the dark. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register Tony recognized from years of standing beside this man in rooms where people's futures got decided in under a minute. How much does he know? I don't know yet. But boss, if he's pulling records on the investment vehicles, on the construction contracts, Tony stopped himself, chose his next words like they were live ordnance. If he's looking at the stuff we've been moving through the shells, that's not a divorce problem anymore. That's a different category of problem entirely. Damien set the folder down on his desk with a deliberate, controlled motion that was somehow more unsettling than if he'd thrown it across the room. Get Natalie on the phone. Boss, I don't think right now is the time to eat. Get her on the phone, Tony. Tony left the room. Damien stood alone at the window for a long moment, his reflection staring back at him. And underneath the rage, underneath the genuine white-hot humiliation of being named a tenant in his own kingdom, something colder moved through his chest, something that felt almost like fear, though he would not have called it that out loud to a single living person. 12 years he had told himself Vivian didn't see him, didn't really see the shape of what he was, the things he did to keep the empire fed, the men who disappeared when the math stopped working in their favor. He had built an entire marriage on the architecture of her not looking too closely, and it had worked year after year because she let it work. Quiet, brilliant, absorbed in her little company, easy to overlook in a world built around men who shouted. He had never once considered that her not looking was a choice, that the silence wasn't blindness, that somewhere behind those calm, watching eyes, she had been cataloging everything. The thought sat in his chest like a stone swallowed whole. Natalie Brooks arrived at the penthouse 40 minutes later, soaked despite the umbrella, mascara already starting to run, and the moment she stepped through the door, Damien knew this conversation was not going to go the way he needed it to. Tell me you're joking, she said, before he'd even closed the door behind her. Tell me this is some kind of, some kind of negotiating tactic, because Jonathan just called me Damien. My husband just called me asking why his attorney friend mentioned an eviction filing with my name attached to a property transaction. Sit down. I don't want to sit down. I want you to explain to me why there's a paper trail with my name on it connected to real estate deals I thought were just... She stopped herself, pressed a manicured hand against her mouth, and for the first time Damien saw, underneath the glamour, underneath the easy confidence she wore like a second skin, something that looked uncomfortably like panic. It's handled, Damien said. It does not sound handled. It sounds like your wife's lawyers just filed something that's about to drag my name into whatever mess you've built, and I have spent the last 8 months telling myself that you knew what you were doing, that this was clean, that I wasn't... Her voice cracked. Damien, am I going to go to prison? The question hung in the room, ugly and unanswerable, and Damien found himself unable to give her the easy reassurance she was begging for, because some part of him, the part that had built 3 investment shells and routed 11 months of skimmed funds through luxury real estate transactions with Natalie's signature on the closing documents, already knew the answer was more complicated than no. Nobody's going to prison, he said anyway. I have people handling this. People. Natalie laughed, a thin, brittle sound with no humor in it at all. You have people handling the fact that your wife now legally owns the house you tried to kick her out of. You have people handling federal investigators. Is that what you're telling me? Because Jonathan's friend, the one who called him, he said the word racketeering, Damien. He said RICO. I don't even fully understand what that means, and it terrified me. Lower your voice. Why? Are your walls bugged? Is that something I need to worry about now too? She was crying now, mascara tracking black down her cheeks, and Damien watched her fall apart with a strange, distant clarity, like he was observing weather happen to someone else. I left my husband for you. I told him I wanted a divorce 3 weeks ago because you told me, Damien, that we were building something real, that this was the start of something. And now I'm standing in your apartment finding out my name is on documents connected to money laundering charges. And you're telling me to lower my voice? I'm telling you to think clearly instead of falling apart in front of me right now, because I need you thinking clearly. His own voice had gone hard, the warmth he'd shown her over the past 8 months evaporating into something closer to the voice he used with captains who'd disappointed him. This is exactly the kind of moment where people make mistakes that get them caught. I need you calm. I need you saying nothing to anyone, not Jonathan, not your friends, not your lawyer if you've already called one, until I tell you it's safe to talk. Natalie stared at him, and something shifted behind her eyes, the first real flicker of understanding crossing her face. Not about the legal exposure, not yet, but about him, about the man standing in front of her giving orders instead of comfort. You're scared, she said slowly. You're actually scared right now. I'm not scared of anything. You are. I've never seen you like this. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing the mascara further, and took a step back from him, putting distance between their bodies that hadn't existed an hour ago. Oh my God, this is real. This is actually real, isn't it? You're not some powerful businessman with a complicated past. Don't finish that sentence. You're a criminal, Damien, an actual criminal, the kind that goes to prison for decades, and I just torched my entire life to be with you. Her voice rose again despite his earlier instruction, panic overriding caution. I left Jonathan. I told my parents. I told my friends. I gave up a marriage that was boring but safe for you, because you made me believe, I made you believe what you wanted to believe. The words left him before he could stop them, cold and cutting, and he watched them land on her like a slap. You knew exactly what kind of man I was, Natalie. Don't stand there now and pretend you didn't know. The silence that followed was total. Natalie stood very still, her chest rising and falling fast, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all its earlier panic, replaced by something flatter and far more dangerous. I want to go home. You don't have a home. You left it, remember? Then I want to be alone. She turned toward the door, and Damien made no move to stop her, watching her go with an expression that gave away nothing, though underneath the stillness, something was already calculating. What she knew, what she might say, who she might say it to if the pressure on her got high enough. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click, and Damien Moreau stood alone in his penthouse with the rain hammering the windows and the city spread out below him like a kingdom that no longer felt entirely his. Vivian woke at 5 a.m. in the unfamiliar hotel room with her phone buzzing against the nightstand. And for a disoriented half-second, she didn't remember why she wasn't in her own bed before the entire previous day crashed back into her at once. A text from Cole. Call me when you're up. Found something. Not good. She called immediately, sitting up against the headboard with her heart already accelerating before he'd said a single word. Talk to me, she said. I pulled deeper into the shell structure last night. The construction contracts I mentioned, they trace back to 4 properties, all of them owned through entities connected to the Moreau organization. But here's the thing, Vivian. 2 of those properties don't actually exist. I drove past the addresses myself at 2 in the morning because I didn't trust the satellite imagery. One's an empty lot in Cicero. The other's a parking structure that's been there since the 80s. No construction. No renovation. Nothing. So the money's going somewhere that isn't construction. Tens of millions of dollars structured to look like legitimate development spend, moving instead into accounts I'm still tracing. And Vivian, I found Natalie Brooks' name on 3 of the closing documents for luxury properties purchased over the last year. Her signature, notarized on transactions that matched the same laundering pattern almost exactly. Vivian closed her eyes, pressed her palm flat against her sternum like she could physically hold her own chest together. She's involved. She's involved in something. Whether she understood what she was signing, I genuinely don't know yet. But her name is on paper, which means she's exposed regardless of what she knew. Cole exhaled audibly on the other end of the line. There's more. I started cross-referencing the dates on these transactions against your company's banking records, purely as due diligence, to make absolutely sure nothing crosses over into Ashcroft Cyber Defense's books. And you're clean, completely clean. Every dollar of company revenue traces to legitimate clients, legitimate contracts. There's no contamination. A pause. But Vivian, I need to tell you something else, and I need you to brace for it. Her stomach dropped. Tell me. 18 months ago, there was a deposit into one of your personal accounts. The joint one you and Damien still technically share, even though it looks like you stopped using it years back. $40,000, routed through one of the same shell structures I've been tracing. It sat in the account for 6 days before transferring back out. If a federal forensic accountant pulls that account history, that transaction is going to show up, and it's going to look, on paper, like you touched dirty money. Vivian felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, even sitting on the bed. I never authorized that. I didn't even know that account still existed in any active sense. I believe you, but belief isn't evidence, and federal prosecutors don't run on belief. We need to get ahead of this. Get you a forensic accountant of your own, build documentation showing you had no knowledge of or access to that transaction, close that account formally, and get a paper trail showing exactly when and how. Today. Not next week. She was already reaching for her laptop, mind shifting into the same crisis gear that had carried her through the night before. I'll call Eleanor the moment we hang up. There's one more thing. Cole's voice had gone careful again, the tone he used right before delivering something he knew would land hard. I think Damien knows I'm digging. My contact at the title company got nervous last night, said somebody had been asking around about who pulled certain records. That kind of thing travels fast in this city, especially in his world. I want you somewhere secure today. Not the hotel. Somewhere with real protection. I'm calling that security firm Eleanor recommended myself right now before we hang up. Cole, I'm not asking, Vivian. I've seen what happens when men like Damien Moreau feel cornered. The eviction filing was a wound to his pride. What I just told you about the construction contracts, the shells, Natalie's name on those closing documents, if any part of that surfaces publicly before he's ready for it, he's not going to feel humiliated anymore. He's going to feel hunted, and men like him don't handle being hunted well. Vivian sat very still, the gray morning light starting to creep around the edges of the hotel curtains, and thought about 12 years of marriage condensing down into this single, terrifying clarity. That the man she had shared a bed with for over a decade was not simply unfaithful, not simply controlling, but something far more dangerous, something she had spent years politely declining to look at directly. Do it, she said. Whatever you need to do. I'm not running from this, Cole. I'm not hiding in some hotel room hoping it blows over. I want every piece of evidence you can find, documented and clean, because I am done being the person in this marriage who doesn't ask questions. By 9 that morning, 2 security professionals from a firm called Hawthorne Protective Services had installed themselves outside Vivian's hotel room and inside a second vehicle parked across the street. Quiet, unobtrusive, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself unless you knew exactly what to look for. Vivian met briefly with the lead, a former Secret Service agent named Renata Cruz, who had the unshakable calm of someone who had stood within arm's reach of presidents and learned not to flinch at anything smaller. We'll be with you everywhere outside secured locations, Renata said. Your office, this hotel, Miss Pierce's law firm. Those are fine. They have their own security infrastructure. Anywhere else, one of us is within 15 feet of you at all times. I know that's going to feel invasive. It's necessary. Understood. One more thing, Mrs. Ashcroft. We've reviewed the basic profile on your husband's organization. I want to be direct with you because I think you'd rather hear this than not. Renata's expression didn't shift, professional and level. If federal interest in this organization is already building, and based on what your investigators told us, it sounds like it might be There's a real chance things accelerate faster than any of us expect. Organizations like this don't fall apart slowly. They fall apart all at once, usually when someone inside starts talking to save themselves. I'd encourage you to prepare for that timeline being compressed. Vivian nodded, filing the information away with the same clinical precision she'd been using for the last 36 hours, and thought, not for the first time, that perhaps the version of herself capable of feeling things fully had simply gone somewhere quiet to wait this out, leaving behind only the version that functioned, that planned, that survived. She spent the rest of the morning at Eleanor's office, going through the discovery of the joint account transaction Cole had flagged, building a paper trail with a forensic accountant Eleanor brought in within the hour. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Nair, who reviewed 18 months of banking records with the unbothered efficiency of someone who had clearly seen far worse. "This is recoverable," Priya said, sliding a folder across the table. "The transaction history shows the account was dormant on your end, sir. No login activity, no transaction initiation from any device associated with you, going back over 2 years. I can build documentation showing you had no operational access to that account during the window in question. It won't be bulletproof, but combined with your sole ownership of Ashcroft's cyber defense and the clean separation of your business banking, it tells a coherent story. Will it be enough if federal investigators come looking?" Priya and Eleanor exchanged a brief look, the kind of look professionals share when they're calibrating how much honesty a client can absorb in one sitting. "It will help," Eleanor said carefully. "But Vivian, I have to be honest with you about something. If this organization is under federal scrutiny, and everything your investigators found suggests it is or will be soon, you're going to be a witness whether you want to be or not. The question is whether you're a witness with clean hands who cooperates, or a witness who looks like she had something to hide because she stayed quiet too long." Vivian sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over her like a physical thing. "I'm not protecting him," she said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not staying quiet to protect Damien." "I didn't think you were." Eleanor's expression softened, fractionally, the closest thing to warmth Vivian had seen from her yet. "But I want you thinking about this now, before it's forced on you. There may come a point where the most protective thing you can do for yourself is talk to federal investigators before they come to you. Get ahead of it. Control the narrative instead of reacting to it." The word sat heavy in Vivian's chest as she left the office that afternoon. Renata, a quiet, watchful presence 3 steps behind her through the lobby. The rain finally breaking outside into pale, watery sunlight that did nothing to lift the weight pressing down on her ribs. That evening, Damien called Eleanor's office directly, demanding a meeting. Not a negotiation, he'd told the receptionist. A conversation. The distinction apparently mattering to him in some way Vivian found almost pathetic given everything else happening around them. Eleanor relayed the request with visible reluctance. "I'd advise against it," she said. "We have no obligation to give him access to you outside formal proceedings. I'll see him." Vivian surprised herself with how quickly the words came, but not alone, and not at the mansion. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere with people around. They settled on a private dining room at a restaurant downtown, Eleanor present, Renata stationed discreetly near the entrance, and Vivian arrived 10 minutes early to claim the seat facing the door. An instinct she didn't examine too closely, except to notice that some part of her had already started thinking the way Cole and Renata thought, the way people thought when they understood that rooms had exits and exits mattered. Damien arrived without Tony, without Marcus Webb, alone in a way that struck Vivian as either a peace offering or a miscalculation. She couldn't tell which. He looked different than he had 2 days ago. The immaculate polish slightly worn at the edges, dark circles under his eyes that no amount of money could conceal. And when he sat down across from her, the table suddenly felt very small. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm here because Eleanor advised against it, and I wanted to see if you'd say anything worth the risk." Vivian kept her voice level, hands folded on the table in front of her, every line of her body deliberately, carefully still. "So far you haven't." "Vivian, I made a mistake." He leaned forward slightly, and she watched him reach, almost instinctively, for the version of charm that had worked on her for years, the warmth he could summon at will when he needed something. "The letter, that was cruel, and I know it was cruel, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend it wasn't. But you have to understand the position I was in." "I don't have to understand anything. Natalie and I, It was a mistake. It's over. He said it flatly, like a fact unrelated to feeling, and Vivian found herself almost laughing at the speed of the reversal. The woman he'd been prepared to install in her house 48 hours ago, now discarded like a position paper that had failed to poll well. I want to fix this. I want to talk about what a real settlement looks like. Something fair, something that doesn't drag both of us through a public circus. There's no settlement to discuss, Damien. The house is mine, the company is mine. The prenuptial agreement you insisted on protects exactly what you think it protects, except now it's protecting me instead of you. She kept her eyes on his, watching for the moment his composure would crack. What I'm curious about is why you're really here, because I don't think it's about the house anymore. Something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, fast and sharp, the look of a man recalculating a chess position mid-game. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you came alone. No lawyer, no Tony. A man in your position doesn't walk into a room without backup unless he's worried about who else might be listening. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping, but losing none of its edge. You're worried about what I know, aren't you, Damien? Not about the house, about something much bigger than the house. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Vivian watched the last of his composure crack like ice under sudden weight. Whatever you think you know, he said, very quietly, you should think very carefully before you say it out loud in a room with witnesses. Is that a threat? It's advice, the kind I'd give anyone I still cared about. His jaw tightened, the muscle visible beneath his skin. You think you understand the world I operate in because you've been married to me for 12 years. You don't. There are things moving right now that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with people who would not hesitate to make examples out of anyone who threatens what they've built. I'm trying to protect you, Vivian, even now, even after everything. Protect me. She let the words sit in the air between them, cold and skeptical. You ordered me out of my own home with 24 hours' notice so your girlfriend could move in. You spent 12 years telling me my business was a hobby while you built something underneath this family that I'm only now starting to understand the shape of. Don't sit across from me and use the word protect. Damien's hands curled into fists on the table, knuckles whitening, and for a moment Vivian saw, beneath the controlled exterior, something raw and dangerous surface in his expression. Not the calculated menace of a businessman negotiating, but something closer to a cornered animal calculating its options. You have no idea what's coming, he said, low and rough. None. And when it arrives, Vivian, I hope to God you're standing somewhere far enough away that it doesn't take you down with it, because I won't be able to stop it. Nobody will. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, and Eleanor's hand moved instinctively toward her phone. Though whether to call security or simply document the moment, Vivian couldn't tell. Damien looked down at his wife of 12 years for one long, final moment, something unreadable moving across his face. Regret, maybe, or fear, or some tangled combination neither of them had language for anymore. This is your last chance to walk away clean, he said. After tonight, there's no version of this where you stay clean. He left without waiting for a response, the door swinging shut behind him hard enough to rattle the glasses on the table, and Vivian sat very still in the silence that followed, her pulse hammering in her throat, Eleanor watching her with an expression of careful, professional concern. Vivian. Eleanor's voice was quiet. What did he mean by that? Vivian opened her mouth to answer, and that was the exact moment her phone began to ring. Cole's name flashing on the screen. 3 calls in the span of 10 seconds. The kind of urgency that meant whatever he'd found couldn't wait another minute. And beneath the restaurant's soft lighting, with the echo of Damien's threat still hanging in the room like smoke, Vivian Ashcroft answered the phone and heard, in the first ragged breath before Cole even spoke a word, that whatever came next was about to change absolutely everything. Cole. Vivian pressed the phone hard against her ear, her free hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. Talk to me. I'm sending you something right now. I need you to look at it before I explain, because I don't think I can say it out loud in a way that makes sense without you seeing it first. His voice was different than she'd ever heard it. Not the careful, measured tone of a man delivering bad news, but something faster, raw, almost breathless. Check your email. Now. Eleanor leaned in across the table, her own phone already out, and Vivian opened the email with hands that had started, finally, after 2 days of forced steadiness, to shake. A single PDF. A wire transfer authorization dated 14 months ago, $40,000, routed from the joint account Cole had flagged that morning. And at the bottom, where an electronic signature certified the transaction, a name that made the restaurant's soft lighting suddenly feel very far away. Eleanor Pierce. Cole? Vivian's voice came out strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. This says Eleanor authorized this transfer. Across the table, Eleanor went very still. Not the stillness of confusion, the stillness of a woman who already knew, with total certainty, exactly what was on that screen and was now calculating in real time how much of the truth she could control. Vivian, Eleanor said carefully, let me explain before you sign this. Vivian held up her phone, the document glowing between them. Eleanor, this is your signature on a wire authorization moving $40,000 of laundered money through my joint account 14 months ago. 14 months ago, before I'd ever spoken a single word to you, before any of this started. It's not what it looks like. Then tell me what it looks like. Vivian's voice had dropped into something cold and flat, a register she didn't recognize in herself, the last of her composure burning away into pure, focused fury. Because right now it looks like the attorney I hired to protect me from my husband's criminal organization has been working for that organization the entire time. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet evening rhythm, oblivious, glasses clinking somewhere beyond the private dining room's closed door, and Vivian found the normalcy of it almost obscene against what was happening at this table. I did legal work for one of Damien's investment vehicles 3 years ago, Eleanor said, her voice low, controlled. The voice of someone who had rehearsed a version of this confession many times without ever expecting to need it. Before you ever called me, it was a single engagement, structuring a real estate transaction, completely legitimate looking on its face. I had no reason at the time to believe, don't. Vivian's hand came down flat on the table, hard enough that the silverware jumped. Don't tell me you had no reason to believe. You're one of the most respected attorneys in this state. You knew exactly what kind of work that was. I didn't know the full scope. I want you to believe that, even if you believe nothing else I say tonight. Eleanor's composure was cracking now, fine lines of strain showing around her eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. I structured one transaction. I was paid a fee that I told myself was generous but not suspicious. And then 18 months passed and I never heard from anyone connected to that world again, and I genuinely believed it was finished. Until I called you at midnight asking you to destroy him. The silence that followed confirmed everything Vivian needed to know. You've been feeding him information, Vivian said slowly, the pieces arranging themselves with sickening clarity. Every filing, every strategy, every piece of evidence Cole's been finding. You've had access to all of it because I trusted you, and you've been… No. Eleanor's denial came fast, too fast. The kind of fast that sounded like panic rather than truth. Vivian, I have not shared a single piece of your case with anyone. I swear to you, your signature is on a money laundering document. Vivian's voice cracked. Finally, the steel giving way to something raw underneath. Why should I believe a single word out of your mouth right now? Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, and that was the moment the door to the private dining room swung open without a knock, and Marcus Webb stepped through it, flanked by 2 men Vivian didn't recognize, both of them wearing the particular stillness of men who'd been hired for their hands rather than their conversation. Mrs. Ashcroft, Webb said, his voice pleasant in a way that made the hair on Vivian's arms rise. I think it's time we all had an honest conversation. Che. Renata Cruz appeared in the doorway behind Webb within 4 seconds, her hand already moving toward the concealed weapon at her hip, her body angling itself instinctively between Vivian and the 3 men. This is a private dining room, Renata said, her voice perfectly level. You need to leave. We're not here for trouble. Webb raised both hands slightly, palms out, though his eyes never left Vivian's face. Mr. Moreau asked me to deliver a message and make sure it was received clearly. That's all. 5 minutes. You have 30 seconds, Renata said. Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. He stepped further into the room, his 2 companions remaining near the door, and Vivian felt her pulse hammering so hard she could hear it in her own ears. a roaring static that made it difficult to track exactly what happened next. "Eleanor," Webb said, nodding toward the attorney with something that looked almost like amusement. "I see you finally had your moment of honesty. About time. Get out, Marcus. In a minute." He turned back to Vivian, and his pleasant expression cooled into something harder, more businesslike. "Mrs. Ashcroft, I want to be very direct with you, because I think directness is the only language that's going to land tonight. Your investigator has been pulling threads that connect to people far more dangerous than my client. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me to stop. I'm telling you that the structure you're investigating doesn't belong solely to Damien. It belongs to the entire organization, and the people above him, people whose names you have never heard and never will, if you're smart, do not distinguish between a wife seeking a fair divorce settlement and a witness building a federal case. To them right now, you look exactly the same." Vivian made herself breathe, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. "Is that a threat, Mr. Webb? It's context." His voice softened slightly, almost paternal, and somehow that was worse than the threat itself. "I've represented this family for 9 years. I've watched good people get pulled into situations they didn't choose and didn't deserve. I'm telling you, as someone who genuinely does not want to see that happen to you, stop digging. Take the settlement Damien is prepared to offer. Walk away with more money than you'll spend in 3 lifetimes, and let the rest of this resolve itself without you standing in the middle of it. And if I don't?" Webb's expression didn't change, which was somehow more chilling than if it had. "Then I hope your investigator is very, very good at his job, because he's about to need to be." He turned and left without another word, his 2 companions falling into step behind him, the door swinging shut with a soft, deliberate click that felt, to Vivian, louder than if he'd slammed it. The room held its silence for a long moment afterward, Renata still positioned between Vivian and the door, her hand only now relaxing away from her weapon. Vivian turned to Eleanor, and whatever fury had carried her through the last 10 minutes suddenly drained out of her, replaced by something colder and more exhausted. "I want you off my case," she said quietly. "Tonight." "Vivian, please. Let me explain everything, all of it, and then you can decide. I trusted you with everything." Vivian's voice shook now, finally, the composure she'd held since midnight 2 nights ago finally fracturing under the accumulated weight. "I told you things about my marriage I haven't told anyone. I signed documents you wrote. I built my entire strategy around your advice, and the entire time there was a version of you connected to the people I'm trying to protect myself from. That connection ended 3 years ago. I have done nothing, to compromise your case since you walked into my office." Eleanor's voice had gone tight, controlled fury battling with something that looked, against all expectation, like genuine fear. "But you're right that I should have told you the moment you called me. I should have disclosed the conflict immediately and let you choose a different attorney with full information. I didn't, because I told myself the old engagement was irrelevant, and that was a mistake, and I'm sorry for it. But Vivian, I am not your enemy. Whatever Marcus Webb just implied about me feeding information to Damien, it's false. I would stake my entire career on that." Vivian studied her for a long moment, searching the older woman's face for the particular tells she'd learned to read over 12 years of marriage to a man who lied for a living. The flicker of the eyes, the micro-tension around the mouth, the half-second delay before an answer that meant a story was being constructed rather than recalled. She found none of those tells in Eleanor's face. She found only exhaustion and what looked uncomfortably like genuine shame. It didn't matter. The trust was gone regardless, burned away by a single signature on a single document, and Vivian understood, with the particular clarity that came from 12 years of learning to survive betrayal, that she could not afford to operate on the hope that someone's regret made them safe. "I need you off my case," she repeated. "I'll find someone else." Eleanor nodded slowly, gathering her things with hands that weren't quite steady. At the door, she paused. "Whatever you decide, Vivian, be careful who you trust next. Webb wasn't wrong about one thing. This is bigger than Damien. It always was." She left, and Vivian sat alone at the table with Renata standing watch nearby, her phone still clutched in her hand, the wire transfer document still glowing on the screen like an accusation she couldn't look away from. Cole arrived at her hotel 40 minutes later, soaked from the rain that had started again. his expression grim in a way that told Vivian whatever he'd been about to say on the phone before the chaos at the restaurant had not gotten any easier to say. "Tell me," she said, before he'd even fully closed the door. Cole set his laptop on the desk, hands moving fast, pulling up a series of documents he'd clearly spent the last several hours assembling. "I found the source of the Eleanor connection about an hour before I called you. That's what I was trying to warn you about. I should have called sooner. I'm sorry. I wanted to verify it before I put it in front of you." "What else?" "There's more, Vivian, and it's worse." He turned the laptop toward her, and on the screen was a financial flowchart, dense with names and arrows, the kind of diagram Cole had built dozens of times during his federal career to explain complex laundering structures to juries who needed visuals to follow the money. I traced the shell structure all the way up, past Damien, past the captains, to the top of the entire organization. Vivian leaned forward, scanning the names, most of them meaningless to her, until her eyes landed on one connection that made her stomach drop entirely. "That's," she pointed, her finger not quite steady. "That's the Cook County Circuit Court judge who's been assigned to my divorce filing. Judge Harlan Voss, 14 years on the bench, and 4 years ago he presided over a civil case involving one of the same shell entities you're now connected to through your husband, and ruled in a way that legal analysts at the time called surprising, given the evidence presented." Cole's jaw was tight. "I can't prove he was compromised on that case, but I found a property record. A vacation home in Wisconsin, purchased 18 months ago, paid for in a structure that matches the same laundering pattern almost exactly." Vivian sat back, the room tilting slightly around her. "The judge on my own divorce case is connected to Damien's organization." "I think so. I can't be certain yet, but the pattern is too clean to be coincidence." Cole rubbed his face with both hands, the exhaustion of the last 2 days finally showing through his usual controlled exterior. "Vivian, I need to tell you something else, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." "What?" 18 months ago, around the same time as that Wisconsin property, around the same time as the deposit into your joint account, there's a payment that went out from one of the shell entities to a private investigations firm. Not mine, a different one." He paused, and something in his face told her the next sentence was going to be the worst one yet. "The firm's name is Halloran Associates. Vivian, I used to work cases with the man who runs that firm, Frank Halloran. We were at the bureau together for 6 years before he left to go private. But, my chance. Cole, what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that someone connected to Damien's organization hired a private investigations firm 18 months ago, and the man running that firm is someone I trained alongside, someone who knows exactly how I work, exactly what my methods are, exactly how I build a case." Cole's voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "I think Damien has had eyes on you for at least 18 months, Vivian, long before the letter on the kitchen island, long before any of this looked like it was starting." The room went very quiet. Vivian felt something cold spreading through her chest, a realization assembling itself piece by piece with horrible, inevitable logic. "He knew," she said slowly. "He's known about my company's growth. He's known about the trust. He's known things he pretended to be surprised about in that letter." "I think it's possible, yes." "Then why—" Her voice caught, and she had to force the next words out through a throat gone tight. "Why write a letter ordering me out of a house he knew I owned? Why provoke a war he'd already lost the opening move of?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on hers, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular gentleness of a man about to say something he wished he didn't have to say. "Because I don't think he was trying to win the house, Vivian. I think the house was never the point." "Then what was?" "I think, and I want to be clear, this is a theory. I don't have proof yet. I think someone needed a reason for a federal investigation to start focusing on you instead of on the people above Damien in this organization. A messy public divorce. A wife with sudden, unexplained access to laundered funds through a joint account. An investigator connected, even loosely, to a compromised judge. It builds a narrative, Vivian. A narrative where, if federal agents start pulling threads, the threads lead first to you. A sympathetic but ultimately exposed wife. Buying time for whoever's actually running this operation to disappear clean. Vivian sat completely still, the implications unfolding in her mind with sickening clarity. You're saying Damien set me up. I'm saying it's possible the letter, the affair, all of it, the entire public spectacle of this divorce, might have been designed, at least in part, to create exactly the kind of evidence trail that ends with you as the face of whatever collapses, while the real architecture of this organization walks away untouched. Cole's expression was grim, careful. I could be wrong, I want to be wrong, but the pattern is there, and I'd rather you hear it from me now than discover it the hard way when federal agents show up at your door instead of his. Vivian stood abruptly, walking to the window, pressing her palm flat against the cold glass like she needed something solid to hold on to. 12 years of marriage, 12 years of believing, even at her angriest, even at her most disillusioned, that whatever else Damien was, he had never been actively, deliberately working to destroy her. I need to talk to Natalie, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Vivian, that's a terrible idea. If any of this is true, approaching her directly, Natalie's name is on those closing documents. She's exposed the same way I might be. Vivian turned back to him, something hard and decisive settling into her expression. If Damien's been using both of us, building two parallel narratives that lead away from the real architecture of this organization, then Natalie and I have the same enemy right now, whether either of us wants to admit it. And if she's not a victim, if she's complicit, fully aware of what she signed, then I'll know within the first 5 minutes of the conversation. Vivian's jaw set. I spent 12 years learning to read people who lie for a living, Cole. I can tell the difference between someone who got used and someone who used willingly. None. She found Natalie's address through Cole within the hour. A service apartment near the river, the kind of temporary, expensive purgatory people retreated to mid-collapse, no longer welcome in the homes they'd shared with the people they'd betrayed and not yet settled into whatever came next. Renata drove her there personally, parking across the street with the engine running, watching the entrance with the alert stillness of someone whose entire job was anticipating violence before it arrived. Natalie answered the door in sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her face scrubbed clean of the careful glamour Vivian had always associated with her, and for a moment the two women simply stood in the doorway staring at each other, 12 years and one shattered marriage and one collapsing criminal empire suspended in the air between them. You shouldn't be here, Natalie said finally. Probably not. Can I come in? Natalie hesitated, then stepped back, holding the door open. The apartment was sparse, generic, half-unpacked boxes stacked against one wall. The temporary chaos of a life interrupted mid-collapse. Natalie didn't offer her a seat. Vivian didn't ask for one. I'm not here to fight with you, Vivian said. I'm here because I think we might both be standing in the same trap, and I think you deserve to know what I know before it closes. Natalie's arms crossed over her chest, a defensive posture, but something flickered behind her eyes. Exhaustion, fear, the particular brittleness of someone who'd been holding herself together by sheer will for days. What trap? Vivian laid it out, carefully, watching Natalie's face the entire time. The shell structures, the closing documents, the possibility that both of them had been positioned deliberately as the visible faces of a collapse engineered to protect people whose names neither of them had ever heard. Natalie listened without interrupting, her face going progressively paler, and by the time Vivian finished, the younger woman had sunk down onto the arm of the apartment's generic gray couch, her hands pressed flat against her own thighs. I didn't know, Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. I swear to you, I didn't know what those documents actually were. He told me they were investment structures, tax efficient, completely legal. He told me signing them was a formality, that his lawyers handled everything, that I didn't need to read every page because he'd never put me at risk. She laughed, a brittle, broken sound. I believed him because believing him was easier than asking questions I didn't want answers to. That sounds familiar? Vivian said quietly. Natalie looked up at her, something raw and unguarded crossing her face. He used both of us. Think so? Yes. I left my husband for him. Natalie's voice cracked entirely now, the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the conversation finally collapsing. I burned down an entire life, a good life, a safe life, a life with a man who actually, genuinely loved me, because Damien made me believe I was choosing something real, and the entire time I might have just been, what, a prop? A distraction? Something to point investigators toward while the real money disappeared somewhere I'll never see? I don't know yet, Vivian admitted, but I think we both need to find out, together, before either of us becomes the answer to a question federal prosecutors haven't finished asking. Natalie wiped at her face, smearing what little makeup remained, and when she looked back up at Vivian, something had shifted in her expression. Not friendship, not yet, but the particular alliance that forms between two people who recognize suddenly that they've been played by the same hand. What do you need from me? Everything you remember about those closing documents. Every conversation with Damien about money, about the real estate purchases, about anything that felt off even if you didn't let yourself examine it at the time. And I need you to talk to a lawyer of your own. Not anyone connected to Damien's world. Someone clean. Before you say another word to anyone. Natalie nodded slowly, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other. 12 years of quiet rivalry and one catastrophic betrayal dissolving into something far stranger. A shared understanding that the man who'd shaped both their downfalls had perhaps never seen either of them as anything more than tools. That was the moment Vivian's phone rang. Cole's name on the screen again, and something in the timing, barely 20 minutes since she'd left him, sent ice down her spine before she'd even answered. Cole? Vivian. His voice was different than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual careful control, raw in a way that made every hair on her body stand up. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to stay exactly where you are, with Renata, until I get there. What happened? Frank Halloran, the investigator I told you about, the one Damien's people hired 18 months ago. Cole's breathing was fast, uneven, the sound of a man who'd just run somewhere or was trying very hard not to. I went back through everything tonight, cross-referencing every piece of evidence I've built for you against what I could find on Halloran's firm. Vivian, he's not just connected to Damien's organization. He's been feeding information back to them this entire time. About you, about your movements, about every piece of evidence I've assembled. How is that possible? You said you were careful. You said, I was careful about everything except one thing. Cole's voice cracked, the first time she'd ever heard him sound less than fully composed. 3 months ago, before any of this started, before the letter, before I ever knew your name would matter, I consulted with Halloran on an unrelated case, a professional courtesy between old colleagues. I mentioned in passing that I was doing some preliminary work for a new client, a woman building a cybersecurity company, married into a complicated family situation. I didn't give him your name. I didn't think it mattered. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Vivian's feet. Cole. He's known I was working for you almost since the beginning, Vivian, which means Damien's organization has known. Which means every move we've made, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy, every conversation we thought was private, there's a real chance it's all been compromised from the start. His voice dropped to something almost unrecognizable, raw with a guilt she'd never heard from him before. I think I've been the leak, not intentionally, not maliciously, but I think every advantage we believed we had might have been an illusion the entire time. And I am so sorry, Vivian. I am so sorry I didn't see it sooner. The line went dead. Not disconnected, dead. The particular silence of a call cut off mid-sentence rather than ended, and Vivian stood frozen in Natalie's half-unpacked apartment with the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to nothing, her heart slamming against her ribs hard enough to hurt, while outside the window the rain had started again, hard and sudden, hammering against the glass like something trying to get in. Cole! Vivian's voice tore out of her, raw, the phone still pressed so hard against her ear the plastic bit into her skin. Nothing. Just dead air, the faint click, click, click of a disconnected line. She redialed. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. She redialed again. Same thing. What happened? Natalie was on her feet now, sweatpants forgotten, every trace of her earlier collapse burned away by the sudden electricity in the room. I don't know. The line just... Vivian's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone reaching for her contacts. She called Renata instead, who picked up before the first ring finished. I heard, Renata said, already moving. Vivian could hear a car door, an engine turning over. I'm pulling around front right now. Get downstairs. Cole's office, the West Loop building, do you know it? I'm already routing there. Move, Vivian, now. They left Natalie's apartment at a run, Renata's SUV screeching to the curb 30 seconds later, and Vivian threw herself into the back seat with her heart climbing into her throat, every red light between the river and the West Loop feeling like a personal assault. Natalie, unbidden, had followed them down and climbed in beside her, and neither of them spoke a single word for the entire 11 minutes it took to cross the city. The only sound, the wet hiss of tires on rain-slicked pavement, and Vivian's own breath, fast and shallow, fogging against the cold window glass. Cole's building was a converted warehouse on Lake Street, 4 stories, his office on the 3rd floor behind a door that should have been locked. It wasn't. It stood open 6 inches, light spilling into the dark hallway in a thin yellow blade, and Renata's hand went immediately to her weapon as she pushed it the rest of the way open with her shoulder, her body angled low, sweeping the room before she let Vivian pass the threshold. "Clear," Renata said, but her voice had an edge to it that didn't match the word. Vivian stepped inside and felt the air leave her lungs. The office had been torn apart. Filing cabinets overturned, drawers ripped out and dumped, Cole's monitor smashed on the floor, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks, glass crunching under her shoes as she crossed the room. His desk chair lay on its side. And on the floor beside it, dark against the gray industrial carpet, a stain that made Vivian's stomach drop through the floor. Blood. Not a pool, not enough to suggest the worst, but enough. A smear, a handprint dragged across the edge of the desk. The unmistakable evidence that something violent had happened in this room within the last half hour. "Cole!" Vivian's voice came out a whisper, then a scream, tearing through the empty office. "Cole!" No answer, just the hum of the building's old fluorescent lights, one of them flickering rhythmically overhead, and the distant wet sound of rain against the warehouse windows. Renata was already moving, sweeping the small adjoining bathroom, the closet, methodical and fast, while Natalie stood frozen in the doorway with both hands pressed over her mouth. "He's not here," Renata said, returning. "No body." "That's good, Vivian. That's actually good. If they wanted him dead, they'd have left him here. They took him somewhere." "That's not better." Vivian's legs had gone weak beneath her, and she gripped the edge of the overturned desk to keep herself upright, glass crunching beneath her palm hard enough to draw a thin line of blood across her skin that she didn't even feel yet. "Renata, that's not better. They have him. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered before the first ring finished, her voice cracking on a single word. "Cole?" "Mrs. Ashcroft." Not Cole's voice. A voice she didn't recognize. Flat, businesslike, the particular calm of a man for whom this was simply a transaction. "Your investigator is alive. For now. Whether that continues depends entirely on what happens in the next 2 hours." "Who is this? What do you want?" "You know what we want. Everything Cole Mercer has compiled, every document, every financial trace, every piece of the case he's built against the people above your husband. All of it, delivered, and we forget this entire conversation happened. You go back to your divorce, your investigator goes home with all his fingers attached. Everyone walks away." Vivian's eyes squeezed shut, her free hand pressed flat against her sternum like she could physically hold herself together by force. "And if I refuse? Then we'll have a very different kind of conversation about what happens next. And I don't think you want that, Mrs. Ashcroft. You have 2 hours. I'll call this number again with instructions." The line went dead. Vivian stood in the wreckage of Cole's office, the phone trembling in her bloodied hand, and for one long, terrible moment, every instinct in her body screamed at her to simply hand over everything. Every document, every piece of evidence, every shred of the case she and Cole had built together, if it meant Cole came home breathing. "Vivian," Renata's voice cut through the spiral, steady, grounding. "Look at me. We are not negotiating with kidnappers based on a phone call from a burner number. We call the FBI right now. This stopped being a private matter the moment they took him. If I call the FBI and they panic, if they think I've turned on them..." Vivian's voice broke entirely now, the last of her composure dissolving. "They'll kill him, Renata. They'll kill him, and I'll have done it by trying to do the right thing. And if you give them everything Cole's built, you think they let him walk away clean? You think a man who's seen what Cole's seen, the judge, Halloran, the entire structure above Damien, survives long enough to tell anyone what happened to him?" Renata's grip on Vivian's shoulders was firm, urgent. They're not letting him go either way, Vivian. The only question is whether we get help that can actually find him before it's too late. Vivian stood frozen between two impossible choices, her chest heaving, blood from her cut palm dripping slowly onto the cracked monitor glass at her feet. And somewhere in the wreckage of the room, Natalie had gone to her knees beside the overturned desk, pulling something free from beneath a collapsed filing cabinet. Cole's secondary laptop, the one he used for backups, miraculously undamaged. Vivian. Natalie's voice was shaking, but urgent. If he backed up his files somewhere secure, somewhere they don't know about, we might still have everything they're trying to take from him, which means we might still have leverage. It was the first useful thing anyone had said in 4 minutes, and Vivian latched onto it like a drowning woman finding driftwood. He mentioned a cloud server, Vivian said, her mind suddenly clicking back into the analytical gear that had carried her through 12 years of building a cybersecurity company from nothing. Encrypted, separate from his main systems. He told me about it the first night, said it was where he kept anything that mattered in case something happened to his office equipment. Can you access it? Vivian was already moving, dropping into what remained of Cole's desk chair, pulling the laptop toward her bleeding hand leaving a faint red smear across the keyboard. I don't have his credentials, but I know how he thinks. I know how I would build a system like this. Her fingers flew across the keys, years of cybersecurity instinct overriding the panic screaming through every other part of her body. Renata, call whoever you trust at the bureau, Cole's former colleagues, anyone who knew him there. We need federal resources finding him, now, while I work on this. Renata was already on her phone, moving toward the broken window for better signal, her voice low and urgent as she relayed coordinates, descriptions, the scene of the office. Vivian worked for 6 minutes that felt like 60, trying recovery protocols, password patterns built from things Cole had mentioned in passing over the last 2 days. His old badge number from the bureau, a partial reference to a daughter he'd mentioned once and never again, the address of the West Loop office itself. Until finally, on the 7th attempt, something clicked, and the encrypted drive unlocked in front of her. Files. Dozens of them. Financial flowcharts, witness statements Cole had apparently been quietly gathering from disillusioned former captains, banking records stretching back 3 years, and at the very top of the directory, a document labeled simply Insurance, open if something happens to me. Vivian's hands trembled as she opened it. It was a letter, addressed to her. Vivian, if you're reading this, something went wrong, and I want you to have everything before anyone else does. I've documented the full structure above Damien. 3 names, not just Halloran. Judge Voss is the smallest piece of this. The real architecture runs through a holding company called Meridian Capital Partners, which on paper is a legitimate private equity firm, and underneath that paper is laundering for at least 4 organized crime families across 2 states. Damien isn't running this operation. He's middle management. The person actually controlling Meridian is someone I haven't fully confirmed yet, but every financial trail I've built points to a single individual whose name appears nowhere on any public document connected to the firm. I was getting close to confirming it when the letter cut off mid-sentence. Vivian stared at the screen, her pulse roaring in her ears, and that was the exact moment her phone rang again. The same unknown number. Time's moving faster than I told you, Mrs. Ashcroft, the flat voice said. We know your investigator had backup files. We know you're trying to access them right now. I'd stop if I were you, because every minute you spend digging through that drive is a minute closer to a very bad outcome for Mr. Mercer. Ice flooded through Vivian's veins. How do you know what I'm doing right now? Because we're closer than you think. A pause, deliberate, designed to land like a blow. Look out the window, Mrs. Ashcroft. Vivian's blood went cold. She turned, slow, toward the warehouse's tall industrial windows, rain streaking the glass in long silver lines, and across the street, parked beneath a flickering street lamp, sat a black sedan with its headlights off, a shape behind the wheel that was unmistakably watching the building. Renata, Vivian breathed. Renata was already moving, weapon drawn now, positioning herself at the edge of the window without exposing her silhouette. I see it. 2 hours just became 30 minutes, the voice on the phone said. Bring everything you found to the address I'm about to text you. Come alone, Mrs. Ashcroft. If anyone else shows up, police, federal agents, your security, Mr. Mercer doesn't survive the night. 30 minutes. The line went dead again. A text arrived seconds later. An address on the south side, an abandoned industrial property near the river, the kind of location chosen specifically because no one would hear anything that happened there. Vivian, you are not going alone. Renata's voice was iron. That's not a negotiation, that's an execution waiting to happen. If I don't go, they kill him. If you go alone, there's a very real chance they kill both of you, and we never find either body. Renata grabbed Vivian's arm, forcing eye contact, her own composure cracking for the first time since Vivian had met her. Let me call this in properly. Federal agents can have a tactical team at that location in 20 minutes if we move now. They said 30 minutes, Renata, and that man across the street is watching this building right now. If federal vehicles show up anywhere near that address, Cole is dead before anyone gets through the door. I know how this works. I've seen what Damien's organization does to people who don't follow instructions. Natalie, still kneeling by the laptop, looked up with something fierce and unexpected burning behind her eyes. Then don't go in alone. Go in prepared. Vivian looked at her, uncomprehending for a half-second, until Natalie continued, her voice gaining speed and certainty as the plan assembled itself in real time. You said Cole's files name Meridian Capital Partners. You said there's a controlling individual whose name doesn't appear anywhere on public documents. If we can identify that person right now in the next 20 minutes, you walk into that meeting not as a victim trading evidence for her friend's life. You walk in as someone who already knows exactly who's really in charge, and you make that the price of Cole's safety instead. That's insane. We don't have 20 minutes to crack something Cole spent 18 months building. We don't need 18 months. Natalie was already pulling the laptop toward herself, scrolling through the financial flowcharts with a speed that startled Vivian, until she remembered suddenly that Natalie had spent the last year unknowingly signing documents inside this exact structure. I recognize some of these entity names. I signed closing paperwork connected to at least 2 of them. There was always a name that came up in conversations with Damien's people that never appeared on any document. They called him the chairman, like a joke, like an inside reference. I never asked who they meant. I should have. Can you find it? I can try. Natalie's hands moved fast across the keyboard, cross-referencing entity registrations, board filings, anything Cole had archived that might connect a real name to the shadow sitting atop Meridian Capital. Vivian watched her work with something between disbelief and desperate hope, the seconds bleeding away, the man in the sedan across the street still watching, still waiting. 4 minutes passed. 5. Vivian's phone buzzed with a countdown she could feel in her bones rather than see on a screen. There's sec. Natalie's voice cracked with the discovery, turning the laptop so Vivian could see. A single document, a notarized power of attorney, buried 6 folders deep in Cole's archive, granting signing authority over Meridian Capital Partners to an individual whose name made Vivian's entire body go cold. Not a stranger. Not some faceless crime boss she'd never heard of. A name she had sat across from at galas. A name attached to a face that had smiled at her, complimented her work, shaken her hand at industry events with the easy, practiced warmth of someone the entire city trusted implicitly. "Oh God," Vivian whispered. "You know him," Natalie said, watching her face. "Everyone knows him." Vivian's hands had started shaking again, not from fear now, but from the sheer vertiginous scale of what she was looking at. "Renata, we need to move. Now. I know exactly what I'm walking into, and I know exactly what I need to say to keep Cole alive. But we are out of time." Renata's jaw tightened, already calculating tactical options at a speed Vivian couldn't follow. Her phone pressed to her ear, issuing rapid instructions to someone on the other end. Positioning, perimeter, a quiet request for backup that would need to stay invisible until the exact right moment. 12 minutes to the address. I need 3 of those minutes to brief my team without anyone in that sedan seeing us communicate. Then we don't have 12 minutes. We have 9. Vivian grabbed the laptop, shoving it and a printed page of the power of attorney document into her bag with hands that had finally, terrifyingly, stopped shaking, replaced by something harder, colder, the same gear that had carried her through every crisis of the last 72 hours, compressing now into a single, focused point. "Natalie, stay here with backup security. If something happens to me, you take everything on this drive straight to federal agents yourself. Don't trust anyone else with it. Not Eleanor, Not anyone connected to the city's legal establishment until you know exactly who's clean. Vivian, promise me. Natalie's eyes were wet, but she nodded, fierce and certain. I promise. Vivian moved toward the door, Renata falling into step beside her, both women's faces set with the particular grim determination of people walking willingly into something they understood might not let them walk back out. And as they descended the warehouse stairwell into the rain-soaked dark of the parking lot, Vivian's phone buzzed one final time with a message that confirmed everything she already feared and somehow still wasn't ready for. A photo. Cole, bound to a chair in what looked like the interior of an empty warehouse, blood at his temple, his eyes open and alert despite everything, finding some way even now to hold himself with a flicker of defiance. And beneath the photo, 3 words from the unknown number that turned Vivian's blood to ice water in her veins. 8 minutes left. The warehouse smelled like rust and standing water, the kind of cold that got into bone instead of skin. Vivian stepped through a half-open loading door with Renata a half-pace behind her, rain still dripping from both their jackets, and the first thing she saw across the cavernous dark space was Cole, exactly as the photo had shown him, bound to a metal chair under a single hanging work light, blood dried black at his temple, his eyes finding hers immediately across the distance and widening, not with relief, but with warning. Don't, Cole rasped. Vivian, don't. Quiet. The voice came from the shadows beside him, and a man stepped into the light. Not the flat-voiced stranger from the phone, but someone Vivian recognized instantly, someone whose face had smiled at her across a dozen charity galas, whose hand she had shaken at industry dinners while he complimented her company's growth with what she'd always believed was genuine admiration. Richard Calloway, 61 years old. Chairman of the Calloway Foundation, a name synonymous in Chicago with old money, philanthropy, civic respectability, the kind of man newspapers called a pillar of the community, the kind of man nobody questioned because nobody had ever given them a reason to. Mrs. Ashcroft. Calloway's voice was warm, almost gentle, the same practiced warmth she'd heard from him 100 times before, and now it made her skin crawl. I'd hoped this could be resolved without you needing to see my face, but I understand you're a thorough woman. I respect that, actually. It's rare. You're the chairman, Vivian said, her voice steadier than she felt, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag where the laptop and printed document sat like a loaded weapon. Meridian Capital, Damien, Judge Voss, all of it traces back to you. Damien is a useful, ambitious man who mistook proximity to real power for actually possessing it. Calloway's tone carried something almost fond, the way a man might speak about a clever dog. He built a respectable little kingdom and never once asked himself who was actually financing his expansion, who was cleaning his money, who was protecting him from federal attention for 9 straight years. He assumed it was his own brilliance. People like Damien always do. And me? Vivian's eyes flicked to Cole, to the blood at his temple, fighting the urge to run to him, knowing any movement right now could be the wrong one. What was I supposed to be in this? Initially? Nothing. Irrelevant. Calloway began walking a slow circle around the open space, his shoes echoing on the concrete. But then your little cybersecurity company started growing faster than anyone anticipated, and you started asking the kind of questions that made certain people nervous, and your husband, in his infinite arrogance, decided the simplest solution was to discard you publicly and let the chaos of a messy divorce create exactly the kind of distraction that keeps federal attention occupied while real business continues uninterrupted elsewhere. You used the divorce as cover. I used your husband's ego as cover, Mrs. Ashcroft. The divorce was simply the shape it happened to take. Calloway stopped walking, his eyes settling on her with something cold finally surfacing beneath the warmth. And now, here we are. You've found me. Your investigator built a case impressive enough that I genuinely don't know how to make it disappear cleanly anymore. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer, because, Mr. Mercer's life depends on what you say next. Ask it. What do you actually want? Not what you think you're supposed to want. What you, Vivian Ashcroft, actually want, sitting here in this room, right now. Vivian held his gaze, and somewhere behind her ribs, The fear that had been driving her for 3 straight days settled, suddenly, into something colder and steadier. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act through it rather than around it. "I want Cole alive," she said. "I want my company protected. And I want you to understand that I am not the kind of person who negotiates from a position of weakness, even when I'm standing in a room with a man who could have me killed tonight." Something flickered behind Calloway's eyes. Amusement, maybe, or the first flicker of genuine surprise he'd shown all evening. Bold, for a woman with no leverage. "I have all the leverage, but—" Vivian pulled the laptop from her bag, holding it up, not offering it, simply showing it. "Cole's files don't just exist on this drive. They've been backed up to a secure server outside the country, time-stamped, encrypted with a release protocol that triggers automatically if I don't personally check in every 24 hours. It was a lie, constructed in the 9 minutes between the warehouse stairwell and this moment, built on instinct and desperation and 12 years of learning exactly how men like this thought. If anything happens to me, to Cole, to my security team, to Natalie Brooks, everything goes to the FBI, the SEC, and 3 major newspapers simultaneously. Not Judge Voss, not Halloran, you, Richard, your name, your face, your entire foundation, your entire respectable life, gone within 48 hours. The warehouse went very still. Even the rain on the metal roof seemed to pause. "You're bluffing. Try me." Vivian's voice didn't waver, though her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her throat. "You've spent your entire life being the man nobody suspects. That protection only works as long as nobody's actually looking at you. I'm looking at you, Richard, and I've made absolutely certain that if I disappear, plenty of other people start looking too." Calloway studied her for a long, silent moment, and Vivian forced herself to hold perfectly still under that scrutiny, every cell in her body screaming to look away, to flinch, to give him some small tell he could exploit. She didn't. 12 years of marriage to a dangerous man had taught her, if nothing else, how to stand still inside fear without letting it show on her face. "What do you propose?" Calloway said finally, "as an alternative to mutual destruction? You let Cole go, unharmed, tonight. You stay away from me, from my company, from Natalie Brooks, permanently. And in exchange, the evidence Cole's compiled about Meridian's structure and the broader organization stays focused on Damien and the people directly beneath him, not on tracing the full chain up to you. I'm not protecting you out of mercy. I'm protecting myself, because the moment your name becomes public, this becomes a federal circus with my company's name dragged through every headline for the next 5 years, and I have spent too long building Ashcroft cyber defense clean to let your collapse contaminate it." It wasn't entirely a lie. Some calculations were genuinely practical. But beneath the practical calculation sat something else, something Vivian hadn't fully admitted to herself until the words were already leaving her mouth. She had no actual desire for revenge against a stranger. Her war had only ever been with Damien. Calloway considered this for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then, slowly, he nodded toward one of the men standing near Cole's chair. "Cut him loose." The man moved forwards, a knife flashing briefly in the dim light, and the ropes binding Cole's wrists fell away. Cole rubbed at his wrists, wincing, blood still tacky at his temple, and pushed himself unsteadily to his feet, his eyes never leaving Vivian's face. "This conversation never happened," Calloway said, his voice returning to its practiced, pleasant register, as though they'd simply concluded a business meeting rather than a hostage negotiation. "I trust you'll honor your end. I will, if you honor yours." Calloway smiled, thin and cold, and turned to walk back into the shadows from which he'd emerged, his men falling into step behind him, and within 90 seconds the warehouse stood empty except for Vivian, Renata, and Cole. The only sound the rain against the roof and Cole's ragged, uneven breathing. Vivian crossed the space at a run and caught him as his knees buckled, both of them sinking partway to the cold concrete floor, her arms wrapped around him while he shook against her shoulder, adrenaline finally draining out of his body all at once. "You shouldn't have come," he said into her shoulder, his voice cracking. "Vivian, that was insane. That was—" "I know. You bluffed a man like that with nothing. If he'd called it—" "He didn't." She pulled back just enough to look at his face, at the blood and the exhaustion and the relief flooding his eyes. Are you all right? I will be. He managed something close to a laugh, shaky and disbelieving. Remind me never to underestimate you again. Yemt. The federal raids began 9 days later. Cole's documented evidence, combined with his original bureau contacts and a forensic accountant, Vivian's own legal team had quietly engaged to verify everything independently, found its way through careful, anonymous channels to the right desks at the FBI's Organized Crime Division. Vivian had insisted on one condition throughout the entire process. Richard Calloway's name would not appear in the initial filing, not out of loyalty to a deal made under duress in a freezing warehouse, but because she'd learned, watching her own marriage collapse, that some battles were worth fighting and some were simply not hers to fight. Calloway's empire, she suspected, would eventually collapse under its own weight regardless of her involvement. She was right. 18 months later, an unrelated tax investigation would unravel the Calloway Foundation entirely, though by then Vivian had built enough distance from the entire affair that her name never once appeared in the coverage. But Damien's collapse came fast, and it came complete. Federal agents hit 4 properties simultaneously at dawn: the glass-walled office on the 34th floor, 2 of the 4 construction properties Cole had identified as empty laundering fronts, and the penthouse where Natalie had once believed she was building a new life. Vivian watched the news coverage from her hotel room with Renata seated beside her. Footage of agents and windbreakers carrying boxes of files out of buildings she'd once visited as a guest, a wife, a missus. Moreau, who'd smiled politely at dinners she'd later understood were staged entirely for an audience she'd never been part of. Damien was arrested at 6:40 that morning in handcuffs, on the sidewalk outside his own building, the footage replaying for days on every local news station. The once untouchable boss of an organization that had operated in this city for 2 decades led to a federal vehicle in full view of cameras he could no longer control. Tony Ricci was the first to flip. Within 72 hours of his own arrest, facing a sentence that would have kept him in federal custody until he was nearly 90, Tony sat down with prosecutors and gave them 11 hours of testimony detailing 15 years of organizational structure, financial routing, and operational decisions that connected directly back to Damien's personal authorization. 2 more captains followed within the week, each one calculating. With the cold practicality of men who'd spent their careers reading risk, that loyalty to a falling king bought nothing but a longer sentence. Natalie was arrested on the 3rd day of the raids, exactly as Cole had warned she might be. Her name appearing on 3 of the closing documents Vivian's intervention had not been able to fully erase. But Natalie had taken Vivian's advice seriously in the days between the warehouse and the raids. She'd retained her own attorney, clean, and unconnected to any of Damien's world, and she'd voluntarily provided a detailed account of her involvement before federal agents ever knocked on her door. It mattered. Her cooperation, combined with genuine evidence that she'd been deliberately misled about the nature of what she was signing, resulted in a plea agreement that kept her out of federal prison entirely. Probation, a substantial fine, and the public humiliation of a name dragged through headlines for months, which in its own way was its own kind of sentence. Jonathan Brooks filed for divorce the same week the raids made national news. Natalie didn't contest it. The trial took 11 months. Vivian attended exactly 3 days of it. The day Tony Ricci testified, the day the financial forensics expert walked the jury through 18 months of laundered transactions with a clarity that made the courtroom go silent with the sheer scale of it, and the final day when the verdict came in. She sat in the 3rd row, Cole on one side of her, Renata a discreet presence near the exit, and watched Damien Moreau stand at the defense table as the jury foreperson read through the counts. Racketeering, money laundering, multiple counts, conspiracy, bribery of a public official, the charge that finally, formally, ended Judge Harlan Voss's career as well. The judge having resigned his position the moment federal investigators began asking questions about a Wisconsin vacation property he could not adequately explain. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 11 times, the word repeated through the courtroom, each one landing on Damien's face like a physical blow, and Vivian watched the man she had married 12 years ago grow visibly smaller with each count. The polish and the power and the easy, dangerous charm finally, completely stripped away, leaving behind only a tired, aging man in a wrinkled suit who would spend the next several decades of his life inside a federal prison. He turned before they led him away, and found her eyes across the courtroom. She expected anger. She'd braced for it for 11 months. The venom, the blame, the accusation that she'd destroyed everything he'd built. What she found instead, in the last look they would ever exchange as anything resembling family, was something quieter and more devastating, something that looked almost like grief. Almost like the boy he'd been at 26, the one who used to laugh with his whole chest, finally surfacing for one brief, useless moment. 25 years too late to matter. Vivian held his gaze, steady, and did not look away. She owed him that much. She'd decided somewhere in the 11 months of waiting. Not forgiveness, not softness, just the simple dignity of not flinching from what they had both become to each other. Then the marshals led him out, and the courtroom doors closed, and Vivian Ashcroft walked out into the gray Chicago afternoon, a free woman in every sense the word could possibly mean. She did not celebrate. She'd known, somewhere in the exhausted, hollowed-out core of herself, that there would be no triumphant moment, no champagne, no sense of victory clean enough to savor. There was only the quiet, bone-deep relief of a war, finally, completely over, and the strange, unfamiliar task of figuring out who she was now that she no longer had to spend her energy surviving it. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier, well before the criminal trial concluded, the property settlement essentially uncontested once Damien's legal resources collapsed under the weight of his own federal charges. Vivian kept the mansion. She kept Ashcroft Cyber Defense, which, improbably, almost defiantly, had grown through the entire ordeal rather than collapsing under it, clients drawn paradoxically to a founder who had proven, under genuine fire, exactly the kind of composure and integrity they wanted protecting their own data. By the following year, the company's valuation had climbed past $100 million, 3 new offices opening in Austin, Denver, and Atlanta, a team that had grown from 40 employees to nearly 300. But the mansion, Vivian found, no longer felt like home. Too many rooms held the wrong kind of silence. Too many corners still carried, faintly, the memory of a marriage built on her own careful invisibility. She sold it 18 months after the verdict, donated a portion of the proceeds, and bought instead a smaller house overlooking the lake from a different angle entirely. Modest by her own financial standards now, full of windows, full of light, a place that felt like hers in a way the mansion never quite had. She founded Phoenix House the same year the trial ended, a nonprofit built initially from her own funds and quickly expanded through donations once word spread through the city about what it offered. Legal aid for women navigating dangerous divorces, financial literacy programs for women who'd spent years financially controlled by partners who used money the way Damien had used silence, trauma-informed therapy resources, career retraining for women rebuilding entire lives from nothing. Within 3 years, Phoenix House had chapters in 6 cities and had directly assisted over 4,000 women. Natalie volunteered there eventually, once her own probation concluded. Not out of obligation, but because she told Vivian one evening over coffee at the lake house 2 years after everything had ended, she'd finally understood what it meant to actually do something real with the wreckage of a life she'd once built around the wrong man's approval. "I used to think being chosen by someone powerful made me powerful," Natalie said, watching the lake go gold in the late afternoon light. "Took me losing everything to understand that's exactly backwards." Vivian, who had learned roughly the same lesson across 12 much longer years, simply nodded and refilled both their cups. She met Nathan Caldwell 2 years after the verdict, at a venture capital summit in San Francisco, where she'd been invited to speak about building a cybersecurity company under genuine adversity, a topic, the organizers had said delicately, she had unique authority to address. Nathan approached her after the panel, not with the practiced charm she'd learned, painfully, to distrust, but with a straightforward, slightly awkward sincerity that caught her off guard precisely because it asked nothing of her. "I just wanted to say," he'd told her, "that was the most honest talk I've sat through in 15 years of these conferences. Most people up there are selling something. You weren't. What makes you say that? You didn't once mention your company's growth numbers until someone asked. Everyone else leads with the numbers." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't the kind of moment screenwriters built entire films around. It was simply a quiet, true observation from a man who turned out, over the following months of careful, unhurried courtship, to possess an almost startling lack of interest in controlling any part of her life. He asked about her work because he was curious, not because he needed to monitor it. He encouraged her when Phoenix House's growth started demanding more of her time to expand rather than scale back, never once suggesting, not in word, not in the subtler architecture of expectation and silence she'd learned to read so well in her first marriage, that her ambition was something to be managed. "You don't have to make yourself smaller around me," he told her once, 18 months into their relationship, both of them sitting on the dock behind her lake house as the sun went down. "I'm not afraid of how big you are, Vivian. I think it's the best thing about you." She'd cried that evening for the first time in years that wasn't grief or fear or exhaustion. She cried because she'd spent 12 years believing that statement was impossible, that loving a powerful man meant perpetually shrinking to fit the space he allowed her. And here was proof, quiet and unglamorous and entirely real, that it had never had to be true. Check. She saw Damien one final time, 3 years after his sentencing, though it wasn't supposed to happen at all. She'd been in Springfield for a state cybersecurity policy hearing, and on her way back to the airport, her car had stopped at a gas station off the interstate. And there he was, released 18 months early on a technicality involving sentencing guidelines neither of them fully understood, standing at a payphone because nobody trusted him with credit, wearing clothes that had clearly once fit a man with more weight on his frame, his face gray and gaunt in a way that made him look a decade older than he was. He saw her before she could decide whether to look away. "Vivian?" Her name in his mouth sounded different now, smaller, stripped of whatever authority it had once carried. "I didn't expect—" "Neither did I." She stood by her car door, keeping distance between them out of old instinct rather than active fear. He didn't look dangerous anymore. He looked like a stranger wearing the shape of a man she used to know. "You look good," he said. "Successful. I heard about the company, the foundation." "I'm doing well, yes." He shifted his weight, glancing down at his own worn shoes, and when he looked back up at her, something raw moved across his face. Not the practiced reasonableness she remembered, not the cold calculation either, just plain exhausted humanity. "I don't have anywhere to stay tonight. I know I have no right to ask you anything, but if you could—" "No." The word came out gently, without cruelty, but entirely without hesitation. "I'm not going to help you, Damien, not because I hate you. I don't actually, not anymore. I spent a long time being angry, and somewhere along the way it just stopped. You're not someone I hate. You're someone I used to know, a long time ago, who became something I never fully understood until it was almost too late." "I'm sorry," he said, and for once, standing gray and diminished beside a gas station payphone, it sounded like he might actually mean it. For all of it. The letter. Natalie. Everything that came after. Vivian studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Closure, maybe. Or simply confirmation that the man who'd once held so much power over her shape and her silence had genuinely become small enough that she no longer needed anything from him at all, not even an apology. "I believe you're sorry," she said finally. "I hope you build something better with whatever time you have left. But I can't be part of it, Damien. I built an entire life out of the wreckage you left behind, and I'm not going to hand any piece of it back." She got into her car. He didn't follow, didn't call after her, just stood there at the payphone, growing smaller in her rearview mirror as she pulled back onto the interstate. And somewhere around the second-mile marker, Vivian realized with quiet, profound surprise that she felt nothing at all watching him disappear behind her. No grief, no triumph, no lingering anger. Just the simple, settled peace of a chapter that had finally, completely closed. She married Nathan Caldwell the following spring, in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Northern California. 60 guests beneath a canopy of string lights as the sun set gold over rows of vines stretching toward distant hills. Natalie stood among the guests, no longer the glamorous stranger from charity galas, but something closer to a genuine friend, forged in the strange crucible of shared betrayal. Cole gave a toast that made the entire reception laugh, and then, unexpectedly, made Vivian cry, recounting with characteristic understatement the night she'd walked into a warehouse with nothing but a bluff and 12 years of learning how to stand still inside fear. Standing at the altar with Nathan's hands warm in hers, the lake of her old life and the war that had nearly drowned her feeling impossibly distant against the gold evening light, Vivian Ashcroft understood something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Damien had believed, writing that letter at his kitchen island 3 years earlier, that he was ending her story, discarding a quiet wife who'd outlived her usefulness, certain that whatever remained of her after he was gone would be small and broken and easily forgotten. Instead, he had handed her, without ever intending to, the one thing 12 years of marriage had quietly stolen from her: the full, undiluted permission to become exactly as large as she had always actually been. Not despite what he'd done to her, through it, and past it, and finally, completely beyond it. An empire built not on fear or silence or the careful management of someone else's ego, but on the simple, hard-won truth that she had never needed his name, his money, or his permission to become the woman standing in this golden light, finally, entirely her own.